People love to hate on the UN about its ability to create change. Though even the organization's fiercest critics admit it has done a lot of good around the world, the UN has also been accused of being complicit in corruption, tangled in bureaucracy, and increasingly reactive rather than proactive in addressing the world's crises. It's also been accused of failing to act to prevent genocides in places including Rwanda in 1994, Bosnia in 1995, and Darfur, Sudan in the early 2000s. Some have even called the organization totally powerless. But there are certain countries in the UN that get to exercise real power. We're talking about the UN Security Council's permanent 5 members, or P5. They all have what's known as the right to veto. So we're going to break down what the right to veto is, how the P5 got this power, and how its implementation has failed humanitarian crises around the world. We also sat down with Salil Shetty, former Secretary General of Amnesty International, to help break down some of the shortcomings of the Security Council's veto power. The P5 have been accused of at times abusing that power. Do you see it that way?
Without question.
To understand that, we need to establish the context in which the Security Council was set up, especially because it's remained largely unchanged since its first meeting. The Council is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations, which was founded in October 1945. Created in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the UN's goal was to, as their charter puts it, quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The US, UK, and then Soviet Union, the 3 major allied powers, were victors of World War II, and they were ready to establish their status and power in the form of an elite council. Former US President Franklin Roosevelt lobbied for China's inclusion as a permanent member of the council, and then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill did the same for France. The permanent 5 members of the Security Council were established and granted veto power, meaning their single negative vote carries the power to reject a resolution.
So you have Russia and China sort of on one side, and you have France, UK, and the United States on the other. So it's kind of the West versus the rest, and that's how it's been organized.
Some of the body's powers and responsibilities include to investigate threats to international peace, to recommend a resolution process, to impose and lift sanctions, and to even enforce military intervention. It's done all of those at various times, including military action against Gaddafi in Libya in 2011 and sanctions against Iran in response to their nuclear program in 2006. The P5 also set aside another 6, eventually becoming 10, non-permanent membership spots. Non-permanent members rotate every 2 years. For resolutions to pass, 9 out of the 15 total members on the council have to vote in favor. So even though they don't have veto power, temporary members still have a really important job. But if even one of the P5 states vetoes a resolution, that's it. And that's happened hundreds of times since the council was founded, often in cases where that state has been accused of advancing its own political interests in the face of global crises.
Because it's like a club, so the people who are the most powerful members in the club, they make the rules. So they're not going to change the rules in a way that it negates their own interests.
So who are we talking about here? Let's start with Russia. They've used their veto power more times than any other P5 member. Most recently, the ally of the Syrian regime has used its veto power 12 times on draft resolutions concerning the Syrian civil war. That includes drafts that would have allowed chemical weapons investigations, imposed sanctions, and referred Syria to the International Criminal Court. More than 400,000 people have died as a result of the conflict in Syria since 2011.
En faisant un tel usage systématique de son droit de veto au Conseil de sécurité, la Russie a trahi l'engagement qu'elle avait pris en 2013 devant ce Conseil de garantir la destruction de l'arsenal chimique syrien.
So the kind of underlying issue is, that every country in the Security Council is there in order to protect human interests, the interest of humanity as a whole, but they tend to protect their own national interests. So the humanitarian or the human consequence of these big powers playing politics is what we see in Syria.
Russia has similarly exercised its veto power to protect its interests around Ukraine and Crimea. But Russia isn't alone in using the veto power in accordance with its national interests. China has vetoed several measures that lended legitimacy to Taiwan's independence, which China doesn't recognize. Meanwhile, the US has voted down dozens of resolutions related to its support for Israel, including those that would have condemned Israeli settlements as illegal, called on Israel to completely withdraw from Palestinian territories, and requested investigations into mass killings of Palestinian protesters along the Gaza border. It also cast the single opposing vote against 14 affirmative votes on a resolution calling on the US to withdraw its embassy in Jerusalem.
One party cannot continue to monopolize the peace process, especially not one that acts with bias in favor of the occupying power at the expense of the law and the rights of the occupied people.
Even the threat of a veto is enough to keep resolutions off the table altogether, as has been the case with the mass killings of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. China, a major trade partner of Myanmar, is expected to veto any related resolutions. So what's been proposed for the future of the veto? Some countries, including P5 members France and the UK, have supported the concept of voluntary restraint. That basically means the P5 would have a responsibility not to use their veto power in situations where mass atrocities are being committed, like Syria, for example. This proposal has gained steam in recent years, with major human rights groups calling on the Security Council to adopt the measure. But some say the veto is necessary to act as a check and balance on foreign intervention, and others say it might be hard to agree on the definition of what constitutes a mass atrocity. Another proposed remedy, rather than restrict the P5's power, expand its membership. Some argue the glaring lack of permanent representation from regions like Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia is part of the problem, and that expanding the P5 to those regions would benefit the Council. India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan are among the popular contenders. Collectively, they formed a group known as the G4 to strengthen their chances of permanent membership status on the Council.
A big challenge the UN faces is how do you make sure that if you start by saying we the people, where are the people's voices in the decision making?
And while some permanent members, like France and the UK, are more open to expansion, Russia, China, and the US have been more cautious or directly opposed. It would take a whole lot of support to modify the UN Charter, and to get all P5 members to agree at the same time to restrict their own power. But despite all of its flaws, experts generally agree. The UN creates a vital space for diplomacy, mediation, and maintaining international peace. It has indisputably helped save lives, lift people out of poverty and starvation, and maintain global order.
I always say, the challenge with the UN is if it didn't exist, we'd be trying to figure out how to invent it.
But it still remains to be seen whether the Security Council will make the necessary reforms to balance power among its members and adequately address global humanitarian crises that are falling through the cracks. We want to hear from you. How do you think the Security Council should be reformed? Should veto power extend beyond the P5, or should it be reined in during mass atrocity situations? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you learned something on this episode of Now This World, please hit that like and subscribe button.